Right. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for listening to another module. So this next module is all about mentoring responsibility, which goes through what are your responsibilities as a mentor and what are the boundaries to that responsibility. This topic is not really meant to be a heavy one, but it can definitely be little bit confronting. Um, this is probably the one module I would like to do and love to have a Zoom chat with you all because it brings up a lot of questions for people. So I'll do this one and then we'll have a Zoom chat as soon as we can to just go through the content and you can fire away any questions that you have. If you have any questions, just write them down now or while we go through the content and then they'll be in your head when we have our chat. So, and just I do have a little bit of a cough thing happening, so hopefully I can get through. So, in this session, the main things we're going to talk about are why mandatory reporting is so important. We're going to examine what are like reasonable grounds for reporting to child safety services. We are going to have a look at the new Tasmanian Child, Youth and Wellbeing Framework. We'll discuss the 5 main different types of abuse and how to respond if abuse is suspected or if it's noticed during mentoring. So just as a preliminary warning, I suppose, some of the content might be distressing for you as we go through the different types of abuse. So if you're finding this confronting or challenging, feel free to pause me. If you're finding that you're continually thinking about it after training, then don't hesitate to give me a ring and we can have a debrief and a chat about it because it can be a little bit distressing. So in defining responsibility, responsibility is described as the social force that binds you to the courses of action demanded by that force. So it's basically a form of trustworthiness. You're being answerable to someone for something and for one's own conduct. So when we place mentors in schools, they're very concerned, I suppose, about what training we give mentors. And whether they're aware of mandatory reporting. So, mandatory reporting is part of being a mentor. It's something that you're probably highly unlikely you'll ever need to do, but it is really important that you understand what it is and when it might be important to actually do mandatory reporting. So, mandatory reporting is an extension of duty of care. Basically, any person in the country, if they feel that a child is at risk of harm, they have an obligation to report. So, in the Child and Young Persons and Their Families Act, the object of that act is to provide care and protection of children in a manner that maximises a child's opportunity to grow up in a safe and stable environment to reach their full potential. So, everybody is responsible for the safety of our children. So, if an adult knows or believes or has reasonable grounds to suspect that a child is suffering, has suffered, or is likely to suffer abuse or neglect, they have a responsibility to take steps to prevent the occurrence of further occurrence of abuse or neglect. So, it's like I mentioned, everybody is a mandatory reporter, and us being in schools, it just means that we might be aware of some of these issues a little bit more than the average Joe on the street, particularly thinking about our mentees, the mentees that we will be working with. Again, it's more likely that we might need to be mandatory reporters. So why should we report? Well, mandatory reporting is a requirement of all professionals or volunteers working with children to report abuse or suspected neglect or abuse of children. A person working with children or young people in the community, you are required and mandated by the Act to inform the appropriate authorities of your knowledge, belief, or suspicion that a child is suffering or is likely to suffer. So we have a really a good service in Tasmania now, which is a telephone number for child safety. I believe it's in your manuals, and it's basically a 1-800 number. So the 1-800 number, you won't get put through to child safety officers or anything like that. They're just like an advisory service. And if you feel that one of your mentees or even one of the students, you come across while you're working in the schools is at risk of abuse or neglect, you can ring this number and tell the operator the situation. So obviously you'd come to us first, because there are it's just important that we have that conversation as well. And if we feel, most 9 times out of 10, we usually do, that that's a conversation that should go further, that's the number you call. You can discuss the case anonymously, and they'll help you with the decision. You cannot be sued or have defamation charges made against you if you report your concerns to child protection or child safety. As a notifier, your details are strictly confidential and cannot be disclosed to others, including the individual that you're concerned about. It is illegal for the Child Protection Program to identify the notifier. The only time you may be legally obliged to report is if it goes to court, and you may be held accountable if you fail to do so. So it is really important, if you don't, to be aware there could be ramifications. So it's better to just report. So the idea is, excuse me, this idea of reasonable grounds or suspicion. How do we know what are reasonable grounds for suspecting abuse? So reasonable grounds could be that a child tells you that he or she has suffered non-accidental physical injury, neglect, child abuse, or severe emotional abuse. Someone else tells you that a child has been abused. Your own observation of the child's physical condition or behaviours lead you to believe the child has suffered non-accidental physical injury, sexual abuse, or neglect. You have serious concerns about the well-being of the child. This could be physical, emotional, or developmental issues. You have serious concerns about the health and well-being of an unborn child. So, for example, pregnant women. So, do remember that number, it's 1-800-000-123. It's a referral line, so it's not a scary line. I've called them before. They're really lovely, really easy to talk to. They'll guide you as to the next steps, if you are ever in the position to make a call to child safety. So just a quick look at the Tasmanian Child and Youth Wellbeing Framework. It was all restructured for this idea of strong families, safe kids. So I will include, we usually actually hand out the hard copy of this, but I will just include it as a link. But there are 6 domains to child and health wellbeing. So being loved and safe, being healthy, participating, having material basics, learning, having a positive sense of culture and identity. So child safety are kind of continually working within those 6 domains of child and youth wellbeing to see where children actually fit in the scales. So as I've mentioned, if you were to call, a staff member would talk to you about the situation. This would include what you're worried about, what you think is going really well for the family, and what you think could even help the family. They will ask for your name and where you work and other details, but this would not be shared with anybody else. So then the child safety, it will sort of move down the line. Child safety might assess the risk based on what you've said. They'll make a record of the conversation and any information, and then they might talk to you about any potential next steps. If there are next steps, look, and often it might just be an accumulation of data. Thank you very much for making the call. You've done the right thing. You might never hear an outcome. It's highly, highly unlikely that there will be a dramatic outcome. Child safety is a complex and interwoven set of rules and legalities, but if there was to be an intervention, often it might look like the family getting support, might be assigned a parenting worker who will come alongside mum with some parenting strategies. Might be using a not-for-profit organisation to tap into the family. Very often it does not involve children being taken away from their parents like overnight, um, because there's just simply not the resources for that, and it's not actually the ethical solution in many times. So there's just this false idea that if I call, the children will be taken away, and it's just not true. It's just alerting um, the organisation to keep children safe that one of the children you're with might not be safe, and could someone look into it? It's really all it is. So, like I mentioned, your confidentiality is protected. The advice and referral line have a legal right to that confidentiality. Um, they will do their best to maintain your confidentiality if this is what you request. Um, so that's something to consider. It is worth considering the fact that sometimes families will actually try and guess who's done the reporting. Oftentimes it comes from a variety of sources. So if New Mornings were to report on a student in the school, there's a highly likely chance that the school has reported, that the after school care program that other children go to have reported, that another program the children are linked into have reported. So it's often multi organisations, multi people. I won't spend too long on the different types of abuse because this is covered in your child safe training, which hopefully you either have started or are on the way to starting. But just a few basic overtones, or I suppose descriptions of different abuse. So physical abuse, which is a significant physical harm or injury experienced by a child as a result of severe or persistent actions or inaction. Sexual abuse is a wide range of behaviours or activities that expose a child to sexual activity that is illegal or inappropriate for his or her developmental level. Emotional abuse is a significant impairment of a child's social, emotional, intellectual, and cognitive development, um, resulting from behaviour of family members or caregivers. So that's a really important one. And neglect is an act of omission. So that occurs when a family or carer does not provide food, shelter, medical attention, or supervision to a severe and or persistent extent that the child's development is likely to be significantly damaged or injury is likely to occur. So just taking a little bit of a closer look at neglect, which is probably the most considered factor with the mentees we're working with. So despite the fact that many people think that neglect is not serious, it's actually incredibly serious. Neglect is a very serious form of child abuse, and it can have such devastating and permanent impacts on children. Survivors often are left with disabilities or just suffer chronic long-term damage from neglect. So the Tasmanian Child Protection legislation, their Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act in 1997 actually declared that neglect was a form of abuse, and many of the cases with child safety have actually been an outworking of neglect. So neglect again is a really interesting one, and we don't want to there have been instances sometimes with mentors, they will see neglect and they'll be ringing up child safety, reporting everything. Again, it's understanding that our values and the way we raise our children are not everybody's values. It doesn't make them right or wrong or better. This means that they are different, and sometimes dietary choices might be different. Uniform wearing of a uniform might be different, or even little things like having a jumper if it's a little bit windy, that might be different. We're talking here about significant neglect. So never having a jumper, no matter what the weather, and child is physically cold, or not having socks or shoes that are appropriate for school. Never having lunch, just not having unhealthy lunch, but never having lunch. That sort of thing is the neglect that we're really, child safety would really be interested in hearing about. And again, it's not to say that there's something wrong that's happening. It's to say that something needs to be done to support mum. So Other instances might be not giving them medicine if they're unwell, not supervising children appropriately for their age, if they're 5, leaving them at home for a weekend or for a night or that sort of thing, or expecting other children to care for younger children on a really large scale. So emotional neglect is this idea of not providing adequately for a child's emotional and psychological developmental needs. Educational neglect occurs when a child is not provided with learning opportunities, and abandonment involves leaving children alone or without arranging appropriate care. Continuing on from where I left off, I did actually get quite sick, which is why I sound a little bit different now to how I sounded before. But yes, I'm really keen to get this module done and dusted for you guys. So I'll just continue on where I left off. So something else that happens or that might happen during your mentoring time is for children to maybe share some stories, or you might be told that your mentee has a history of being exposed to family violence. So family violence is considered a form of child abuse. It's usually perpetuated by one partner over another. The abuse is most commonly manifested as physical, sexual, and or emotional or social abuse. So that's another really common, unfortunately, thing that can happen to children or in children's lives. So I guess the question that you might be wondering, probably not wondering really, but the question we ask ourselves is, why is child abuse so serious? The reason why, as I'm sure all of you know, that abuse it disrupts a child's normal developmental and often it affects their normal development. It affects their ability to manage school and just manage themselves in general. It damages their sense of belonging. It confuses the way that children see themselves, the way they see the world, and it can lead to long-term emotional and psychological issues in the future. So we get this asked a lot, but what do you do if you suspect that abuse is happening, or if it is disclosed to you? So there are some do's and some don'ts, and you'll see these in your manual. I guess the first thing is to think about if it's sexual abuse or even emotional abuse or even neglect is actually disclosed to you personally, it's really important to involve the young person in the process of telling another adult as much as possible. So you don't want to disempower the child further by saying, that's great information, thanks for that. Off you go to recess, I'm going to go have a chat to Mrs. Jones. Don't want to do that. You want to sort of honour the story they've told you. It is this difficult line, and this happens all the time. The issue of confidentiality comes up. So when we do our agreements with mentees, we really are specific about confidentiality, because we want the children to understand that anything they tell us in mentoring time is confidential. However, we can't keep it to ourselves if we feel like the mentee's not safe. So we actually say, if something came up, let's just say your mentee tells you that she's being hurt by her stepfather, for example. That would be an example. You'd say, do you remember when we had our agreement and Kay or Penny said that we talked about confidentiality unless you were being hurt? Well, this is one of those times where I can't actually keep this information to myself. And because we've said it from the start, kids get that, and they will be okay with. Well, I mean, they might find it difficult, they might find it scary, but we have told them that this is the deal, and they do understand it. Some little kids, when we do the mentoring agreement and I mention confidentiality, they get this look in their eyes, almost as if
Yeah, I know what that lady's talking about. I better not tell them XYZ, you know, it's really interesting. Um, so the other thing is, just thinking about allowing children to feel empowered in this process. You might ask them, would you like to tell Mrs. Jones yourself, or would you like me to tell Mrs. Jones? Would you prefer me to tell Mrs. Jones with you there, or would you rather that you weren't there? So allowing them to kind of make their mind up about that decision, huge decision for a child to make, but it is theirs, and they can, and they should have the opportunities to have a voice in this scenario. And often children will usually agree to sharing sensitive information if they believe a positive result will come from sharing the disclosure. So if they believe that, you know, stepdad might not be around anymore, or if they believe that mum might actually get some help with school lunches, often children believe that if they think something might change, it might be worth sharing. So if you're talking with a child and they start sharing some sensitive information about their lives and sharing some of their story, just accept what they say. You don't need to draw them out and ask them for details. Minimum information is often required. Let them say as little or as much as they want. So if they feel like if it's just coming out really fast and they just, I mean, you don't need to say, you know, that's enough, but it is also not harvesting additional information like, oh, tell me more, or, you know, what else happened. Um, so yeah, that's something to be important to kind of be aware of. Listen attentively, as I know you all will. Be supportive, calm, and non-judgmental. So that can sometimes mean not being judgmental towards the perpetrator. You might find it really difficult, but just being neutral is so important. And let the student know who their support person can be at school. So who can they go and tell this information to? Don't make promises. It's really important not to make promises. So you can't promise them that everything's going to be okay. You can't promise them that the parents won't find out that they've made this disclosure to you and then to the school. So don't make any promises. Don't investigate, interrogate, or put words into the student's mouth. Um, Again, don't express judgment or blame to the student, and don't promise not to tell anyone. So some of the issues you might feel if you need to report, some of the concerns you might feel, or emotions, you might feel a sense of fear, fear that sharing this information is going to affect your relationship with the child. You might fear getting involved. You might feel angry about child abuse or the system. You might fear that the child will be returned back to the abusing situation, and you might doubt whether or not the disclosure is actually authentic. I think there's a statistic that it's something like 80% of disclosures or 90% are true. It's very, very rare for a child to lie about a disclosure. So these are some of the issues that might um, influence you to think, oh, no, I won't bother with reporting. Um, it's, sorry, it's probably also really important to be aware that any disclosure that happens, it's really important that you tell New Mornings. So we are your support person. Give us a call, tell us what happened. Sometimes we will ring up child safety as well and do the report. Sometimes the school might encourage you to do to ring up child safety and do to the referral line and do the report. So it just depends on the context and the situation. Self-care is really important. So if something like this does happen, it's really important to look after yourself. So, you know, remind yourself that you don't have to cope alone, that there was a reason why you were chosen to mentor this child. Trust your own judgment and recognize that the student will be helped by just talking with you and knowing they can be with you. So that's a really important thing. So there is a section in the manual now which talks a little bit about mental health self-care, which I encourage you to have a look at. Obviously, we can't really do the self-care wheel of balance exercise through Zoom, but I strongly, strongly encourage you to go through that little activity. Have a look at the areas of your life where you might need to put in some self-care. I mean, this is just such a good exercise to do even if you're not mentoring. So we will have a chat in the Zoom meeting about it, but I do encourage you to go through that and just check to see what areas in your life might need some extra self-care. I think once you mentor a little person, it's surprising how much of an emotional toll it can take. So encourage you to do that, and we'll have a chat through Zoom very soon.